Vai admitindo aí as pessoas. Eu vou mandar aqui uma mensagem no chat. Vai admitindo aí as pessoas. Eu vou mandar aqui uma mensagem no chat. Vai admitindo aí as pessoas. Eu vou mandar aqui uma mensagem no chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. It's a great pleasure for the Atlantic Center to host this seminar, this presentation, and to participate in the dissemination of the report developed by the Global Maritime Program of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which was developed with valuable support of the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the pirates of the Niger Delta. I want to start thanking everyone that has registered to attend. We are very happy with how this initiative was received. We have more than 30 countries registering in to attend, and many more organizations represented. So thank you so much for all of you who took the time and the interest in joining us today. A bit of housekeeping rules. We will have microphones and cameras switched off so that attention is focused on the presentation. And please use the chat function to pose your questions. We will be channeling them to our presenters in the Q&A session after their presentation. We are very fortunate to have with us today the lead author of the report, Katja Linskov-Jacobsen, senior researcher at the Center for Military Studies of the University of Copenhagen, and Giuseppe Sernia, UNODC Global Maritime Crime Program Atlantic Ocean Coordinator, who was responsible for supervision and coordination of the study. So thank you so much to both of you for making the time to talk to the Atlantic Center community, to the group of friends and interested people who are gathering around the Atlantic Center. Most of you are aware of the activities of the Atlantic Center, so allow me just to say brief words to highlight our commitment to support and complement existing efforts to improve security in the Atlantic, in the whole of Atlantic, actually. So maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea, in particular, has been a central issue for Portugal and for many of the states who have signed the Atlantic Center joint statement. This security issue has been addressed in the first seminar of the Atlantic Center back in 2019, and again was the central topic, the central issue of the first training course of the Atlantic Center that took place in the Azores island of Terceira last May. The center is committed to finding new ways to support existing efforts and to bring added value to international and regional efforts to tackle the negative consequences of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, but also to address the causes actually feeding these activities. And I think the report that you will that is being presented today helps us in both these efforts. Among the initiatives that we are developing, I would perhaps highlight its potential as a coordination platform for international action, for the Atlantic Center to be a promoter of respect for international law and support for dispute settlement. For instance, both dimensions can contribute immensely to improving regional relations and to promoting joint action. I would also say that it could work to promote learning lessons and sharing best practices among regional countries, which will be embedded in the capacity building projects that the center is developing and will develop in the coming years with the region. So considering this ambition and the valuable insights of this report, we are set to have here good collaboration, and the report will certainly provide more informed basis for sound policy making for all of the partners involved in the region. I would now give the floor to our presenters, and I would come back then with additional comments after their presentation before opening the floor for Q&A. So Katja, Giuseppe, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking the Atlantic Center for these kind words and for the invitation to present some of the key findings from our report. It was published just recently and it's entitled Pirates of the Niger Delta. Dear distinguished ambassadors, dear distinguished online audience, thank you for your interest and participation. We look forward to discussing the report with you, and also hopefully how we can make use of the findings in the report as we move forward in addressing the issue of Niger Delta-based piracy. Before delving into the content of our very long 90-page report, I first want to acknowledge that this is the result of collaborative efforts within our small research team. I want to thank all experts and stakeholders who contributed immensely throughout the study. Of particular importance and worth highlighting also to this audience, we held a validation workshop in Abuja back in April this year to present an early draft of the report, and we received valuable, very valuable inputs from numerous Nigerian stakeholders, from the Navy, Marine Police, the Amnesty Program, NIMASA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I want to thank all of you for having given inputs. And finally, it's also very important to highlight that through the collaborative effort and the partnership we had with the Stakeholder Democracy Network, we were able to carry out interviews in 3 locations in the Niger Delta region with self-identifying pirate group members. We come back to this, and apologies for spending time on these methodological remarks, but I think it's very important to highlight the knowledge basis that the report is anchored on. So next slide, please, if we have the slides. Can you see the slides okay?
We are not seeing the slides yet, but Louise is going to put them up in a second, and we can continue afterwards. So.
Yeah. The first slide is really the table of content of the report. You won't be able to see all the letters. It's very small. I think it's the one before, but it should be fine. Yeah, it's this one. I put it on, next slide, please, the table of content. Yeah, thank you so much. I put it on merely to highlight, not that I'm good at doing PowerPoints, because I realize you can't see it, but it serves a purpose. It serves to illustrate that the report is very long and very detailed. And also for that reason, Giuseppe and I, in the time that we have kindly been allocated today, of course, won't be able to go into great detail with every single aspect. What we do hope to get through is to give you an appetizer of what we highlight in each chapter of the report. Next slide, please. The chapter opens, as you can see on the next slide, hopefully, with a report that provides historical background and context to the current piracy situation. I can still see the table of content, but I will just move on. We describe in chapter 1 what we see as 3 phases of Gulf of Guinea piracy, starting with the early period of militancy, that's MEND, but also other early militant groups. Then in late 2009, early 2010, shifting to a period that we and also others characterize as petro piracy, with pirate groups hijacking vessels to steal oil cargo. This phenomena we describe has given way for the past 5 years or so to a period that we all know now as kidnap for ransom piracy. And it's this latter phase that we really focus on in the report. In fact, even more specifically, we focus on onshore dimensions of a phenomenon that we think has been described mostly in its offshore characteristics. However, we do also describe how offshore, as you can see now on the slide, we have some maps showing that in the early period, Niger Delta-based piracy was really affecting mostly also the Niger Delta region. But as the phenomenon has developed, it's also expanded geographically to extend throughout the entire Gulf of Guinea. However, I want to highlight that all sources consulted for this report consistently argue that pirate groups seem to take their hostages to camps in the Niger Delta region, which is also where ransom money is dropped and where hostages seem to commonly be released. Next slide, please. So concerning current kidnap for ransom piracy, I realize that this slide too is in small letters, but I hope you will read the report instead. We suggest in chapter 2 that in order to really understand the nature of current kidnap for ransom piracy, it's helpful to distinguish between 3 different types of piracy and maritime criminality. The first type, which is probably the one that most of us are focused on, we call deep offshore piracy. It's pirate groups that are capable of operating up to 220 nautical miles. They are increasingly sophisticated, and they're the ones that most international efforts focus on engaging. But apart from these groups, we see from our interviews and other sources that we consulted that there is a second type of piracy that we in the report term coastal low-reach pirate groups. They operate up to 30, 40 nautical miles offshore, so they're not capable of the same reach as deep offshore pirates, and they usually focus on kidnapping not so much expatriates, but more locals. So the ransom paid are lower, and the duration of the hostages for how long they sit is also less. Then finally, we introduce a term that we call riverine criminal groups. It's important to highlight that these groups are not classified as pirates in accordance with the UNCLOS definition. However, for this report, we still include them for a number of reasons. One being that they self-identify as pirates in the interviews that we conducted. Another reason is that they're often referred to locally as pirates. So we get back to this later. But for example, in local news stories about pirates having been arrested by Nigerian authorities, these are not always pirates, but sometimes riverine criminals. Now, for me, this is an important contribution of the report, this threefold distinction, so I could speak a lot more about it, but in the interest of time, I want to move on to just briefly point to the significance, I think, of this classification. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. As the example of local news stories of pirates' arrest begin to illustrate, we need to contemplate these distinctions when we pose a number of very important questions about current kidnap for ransom piracy. There is that question of who is actually being arrested. Is it deep offshore pirate groups? Is it riverine criminals? Or is it the low-reach coastal pirates? There are many other questions where this distinction adds a lot of nuances to current discussions. I think one other question of importance is the question of how many pirate groups actually exist. If we speak about riverine criminal groups, there are many. Very many, it seems, from our interviews, and they're emerging. One interviewee said almost daily, even if that is not true. It's still a very different picture from that of deep offshore pirate groups, of which we estimate, based on debriefings, interviews, etc., that there's somewhere between 4 and 6. Other questions are mentioned on this slide, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. I think we have to bear in mind this analytical distinction as we discuss current kidnap for ransom piracy. To finish off this chapter, I want to briefly mention that what really needs more analysis than what we managed to do in this report is the question of how these 3 types of piracy relate or not. It might be that they don't, but in the validation workshop that I mentioned before, a few participants discussed the possibility that riverine criminals groups might serve as recruiting grounds for deep offshore pirate groups. That, I think, is illustrative of why more research needs to be done on the relationship between these 3. Next slide, please. So after we've introduced this distinction in the report, we really zoom in specifically on deep offshore pirate groups. And as you can see on the slide, one of the contributions in chapter 3, which I should say is the longest chapter of the entire report, so I won't go into detail with all of it, but we do, again, based on debriefings, public reports, but also confidential reports and interviews, outline what we see as a 4-layer pirate group structure. So there is the top layer of facilitators and also sponsors. Pirates don't themselves have the means to buy boats and equipment and engines and fuel. So there is that top level of, we call them high-level facilitators. Below that level, we have pirate group leaders and negotiators. We can come back to this. I think one question that remained to be solidified, perhaps, is the question of negotiators, whether there's few of them or whether there's a few names circulating that different individuals use. That's not the same thing, obviously. Then below that, we call them special function pirate group members. And those are the ones that, for example, are particularly skilled in navigation. So some of the pirate group members are very, very good at navigating offshore, but also within the creeks and waterways of the Niger Delta region. Other pirate group members are particularly skilled in raising the ladder when you board the vessel. And I think these are the ones that we normally, those are the more visible face of kidnap for ransom piracy. If we see images, it's often at this level. However, I think it's very important to notice that beyond that level, we call them foot soldiers. I'm not sure it's the best terminology. We can discuss that if we have time. But I do think it's important to note that below the level of special group members, there is, for example, those that guard the hostages in the camp. There are women who cook. There's a lot of sort of logistics underneath, which makes it a bigger structure than what we only see if we zoom in on pirate action groups, as they're also called. Describing this structure, I think for us is important in contextualizing that somewhat more narrow focus on attack teams that we sometimes see images of in high-powered speedboats with ladders and fuel and weapons, etc. There's much more to the pirate structure than only those teams. Let us proceed, if we can move on to the next slide, to another part of this chapter, which we call enabling factors. It sort of contextualizes the group structure that I just went through. It includes corruption and collusion, and we begin this section by acknowledging that earlier this year, in February, in fact, Vice Admiral Gambo, for example, acknowledged the challenges that corruption and collusion poses. So it's a challenge that's been recognized to some extent by central Nigerian actors, and a challenge that is also sort of addressed. Now, from observations made in our interviews, we describe a tentative few examples of pockets of collusion, not that we see, but that our interviewees mention and that we try to bring forward in the report, whilst at the same time acknowledging that this is not in any way a generalizable picture. So a few interviewees describe examples of, we call it blind eye bribery. It really refers to interviewees saying that bribes were paid to make security forces not do checks in a particular area for 24 hours. And as I said, this is a tentative finding. We do think it's important to highlight it in the report, but also very important, again, that it's not a generalizable picture. Next slide, please. There is one final thing that I want to mention from this chapter. As you can see on the slide, the chapter describes various estimated, and these are estimated, locations of offshore pirate groups, hostage camps in the Niger Delta region. I think it serves as a contrast to the changes that we describe in chapter 1, the changes from early days MEND militancy to petro-piracy to kidnap for ransom piracy, and also the changes in the offshore location focusing on the Niger Delta region early and now affecting the entire Gulf of Guinea. If we look at onshore camp locations, there seems to be less change and more continuity than if we look offshore. And we can get back to this later, and it's described in more detail in the report. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting findings, I think, from the report is arguably that according to various kidnap for ransom experts that we've interviewed, the estimated annual amount of ransom paid last year, that is in 2002, to various Niger Delta-based pirate groups is around $4 million. For us, I think this was a surprising finding, indicating a business that in strictly financial terms seems smaller than what one would perhaps have imagined from the outset. Besides providing this estimated figure of ransom money paid last year, the chapter also offers some insight into how that ransom money circulates, how it's spent. It offers some reflection on the seeming ease at which it's possible to exchange dollars into Nigerian naira. And it also offers some accounts of how pirates and others spent the money. And those accounts vary from narratives about survival. So it's just actually to get by and to pay school fees for your kids, to other narratives, if we move higher up in the structure that I just discussed, of how property is being bought and construction workers are being paid in small amounts by pirate group members. Importantly, the next chapter contextualizes these ransom money gains by current kidnap for ransom piracy groups in relation to financial gains made from other criminal businesses. Next slide, please. So again, I think, as you can see from this slide, the strictly financial KNR gains, you can see the 4, if it says 1, 4, etc., etc. It actually is a rather small business if you compare it with a lot of other criminal activities in the region that you could gain more from engaging in. And this, of course, poses some questions. I think for us, one of the most important questions was, if it's such a small business, in financial terms, again, not in terms of harm inflicted, why is it then so very difficult to disrupt? Obviously, next slide, please, sorry. Our report doesn't really answer that question to the full. It does begin to point us in some directions of where we might want to go if we want to understand why it's difficult to disrupt a $4 million business. We do this in chapter 5 by contextualizing kidnap for ransom piracy in 2 ways. And those are the ones that we mention on this slide. One is by suggesting that piracy cannot be understood in isolation from broader protection webs and broader structures. One of those structures, we think, our interviews mentioned, both the interviewees we've done with experts, but also the ones with self-identifying pirate group members in the Niger Delta region. They all mentioned the potential, I want to underline potential again, role of individuals with links to election violence in the Niger Delta region. Some of the political positions are very prosperous, and it seems that it's not only democratic means that are used when you gain these positions, but also a level of violence which might involve pirate group members, not as a group, but in their individual capacity. Finally, the chapter includes a section on what we refer to as parallel businesses. The section describes how the kind of insecurity which stems from kidnap for ransom piracy seems to implicitly have given rise to other businesses. For example, the security escort vessel business, which paradoxically, according to our sources, is a bigger business than kidnap for ransom piracy itself. On that note, I would leave the rest of the conclusions to Giuseppe Sernia.
Thank you so much, Katja. Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Licinia. Thank you, Katja. Can I have, please, the next slide? So I would start by saying that this study has gone through several analyses. There is a methodology which is clearly indicated in the first pages of the study. It's a massive work in terms of information, pages and time needed for a detailed study, detailed analysis study itself. But this comes from a 1 year of field interviews, analysis of documents. You can find also reporting, data reporting of the numbers of attacks. But all this, we had a long conversation on what typology of data we would be including in this study. And the conclusion is that the data used are coming from the several already published sources, from the ICC, the Interregional Coordination Center, to the m.gov and others. The quality of the study comes from the field, interviews from the field, material collected thanks to UNODC staff and experts which have been asking information, including Katia, with a long series of structure and destructure analysis, which has taken us 1 year to conduct. And as Katia was mentioned, we went through several two sessions of verification with counter. So we reserve ourselves also the perspective and reserve. We will actually. I'm seeing. Is the quality of the connection adequate for you to understand when I speak?
Let's try it, Giuseppe. Let's try it. Please continue.
Okay, I will try to maybe create a connection, a different typology of connection, which may be more effective. I will also be speaking slowly. First element of the analysis is that this analysis itself is the initial step also. It's providing, though a large amount of information, also the basis for further analysis, and is not only an instrument which can be considered as a closed medium of information. This is also the perspective using this study to further ameliorate the understanding of the piracy phenomenon and acquire additional information from this work. A first element which has not been properly analyzed is what's beyond Nigeria. This study is related to a certain area covering in its purpose the entire area. We may find additional support outside this specific geographic. This is not covered in the study. It may be a topic of further analysis. Then further analysis also related to the different typology. Also Katia was mentioning, and cultism and other aspects which may emerge. Can I, Luis, can I see the next slide? If you can hear me loud and clear.
The slide is up, Giuseppe. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see. Can you hear me loud and clear?
We can hear you now. Please continue.
Perfect. This slide is also showing you some of the elements provided by the study. Again, the paper version of the study, or the PDF version, which you can download online, and maybe we can provide the link to download this document. And can you still hear me? Because I went offline a few seconds. So it's a detailed analysis of how much a piracy business could cost. And this is important because it's not only a question of evaluating the income in terms of ransom to a piracy network, but also the expenses which this network has to deal with. Again, the analysis is highlighting from 4 to 6 groups, each below 50 people, which gives you also a number for the offshore, which is the specific typology of piracy we've been targeting. A number of around 300 pirates or supporting elements into the camps themselves. then without taking into consideration the largest network beyond them, these groups and these 300 individuals. But the analysis is, the economical analysis is also a microeconomical analysis from the cost of speedboats, which have been used, to the cost of the outboard engines, to the cost of the weapons, to the infrastructures which are used in the camp itself, for an overall estimated cost of a piracy camp and let's say the initial investment of no more than $150,000. And you can consider this as a really small investment for a criminal business, which is creating the amount of problems we are seeing. Element which we may need to consider is also the day-to-day investment, which we also considered for a single operation overall in about between $7,000 and $10,000. We believe these are important data because they are providing you the picture of the the illicit financial flows, whether they are to fund or income from the criminal activity. Can we move please to the next slide? All this information can be read in this 90 pages study. Another element, this is only a visualization of the data we already discussed. On one side, the income from kidnapping, so the ransom, which are yearly obtained by the pirate groups, are $4 million per year in an estimation, of course. And if we confront this with the cost of piracy economic only, I'm not touching at all the human cost, of course, but if we only make an economical confrontation with an analysis which is quite outdated, the analysis conducted in 2018 by Ocean Beyond Piracy, you can see that if you look at this in the proportion of a cake, the business, the criminal business, is just a real small part of this cake. And you can also see how much the 4 million have, what's the multiplicator ratio of this 4 million in terms of economical damage. And this is also an important result from this, we believe, this study, together with the description of the typology of criminal groups from the riverine to the offshore, to the deep offshore. The coastal targeting the fishing industry. This is also a sort of specific analysis which may come. The riverine becoming an issue in terms of governance in Nigeria, with local communities particularly unhappy about the riverine groups, and the media, local media, reporting these groups as pirate ones. Well, when these groups they are actually in legal terms cannot be classified as pirates, but still an important element for our analysis. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, in offshore terms, we see in the report also an analysis of how a pirogue, which is called skiff in other regions, but a pirogue with use for piracy attack is, in terms of numbers of people, how they are operating. The region and the expansion of this modality well beyond the Nigerian coast, but also we need to take into consideration that since the publication of the study, we had important, really important news, which need to concur to this description of the overall picture. And these really important news are related to the legal finish element, which we as UNODC are particularly keen. The legal finish is the moment where a pirate group is brought to court, to justice. And we had a few days ago, I believe it was on the 5th of July, the first decision for a piracy case in the entire history of the Gulf of Guinea. The first time a judge pronounced a sentence, sentencing to jail, convicting for piracy a group of people. It's a case in Togo, thanks to the fact that Togo has been doing a long and difficult work of legal reform. This legal reform has allowed Togo to exercise universal jurisdiction and prosecute and judge foreigners, non-Togolese, for a piracy attack, also thanks to the capacity building activities, but mostly and above all because of the will to finalize a legal proceeding. So Togo arrived to this decision, and on the 23rd of July, we also do expect a decision, or at least an important moment in the decision-making process for the Hai Feng case in Nigeria, which will be probably the first case where a piracy sentence in Nigeria may be, of course, if the prosecution gets their argument approved by the court, endorsed by the court, we may have the first case where pirates are sentenced in Nigeria. Again, an important, I would say, an historical moment. We would say an historical moment because this Hai Feng case has brought to the international community the positive results of the work conducted by the Nigerian Navy first, who intervened at such a distance from the coast, arresting the suspects and bringing them to justice. The handover to the prosecution office, the handover of the evidence, the support to the prosecution, the cooperation between the agencies. I mean, the Hai Feng is a case study for everybody, and we do expect that once the decision will come out, we may use this case again to showcase the importance of the legal finish. First moment where we will have actually the word piracy coming out of a sentence, whether it's for conviction or acquittal, but coming out of a sentence from a Nigerian judge. Federal judge, of course, because the SOPMO Act passed after many effort by the Nigerian authorities in 2019 is an act which is defining piracy and also providing those jurisdiction elements which are needed for proper prosecution and trial. So this is important, it's extremely important, the legal finish, also to evaluate the response to the piracy phenomena. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, the next slide is just to thank you everybody and to open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe. We were able to listen to you well in the final stretch, so thank you so much for that. Good to be able to have you directly with us. Before opening the floor for questions, and yes, in Spanish is also fine. We'll make an effort for translation. Allow me just some brief comments and using this my function also as a discussant, if you want, to kick off the debate, and hopefully this will give a bit of time for everyone else to pose some of their questions and comments. Before opening the floor, I would really highlight a few topics that I think, three of them, that I think are key to what the report does and allows us to also do when we deal with the issue of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, and then the issue specific that the report addresses, because as both Katia and Giuseppe mentioned, this is a partial picture of the issues of the region, focusing very much on a specific region in Nigeria. And of course, we need to broaden the scope, and many of us actually do in our activities. So this is just another step in providing us the means to address a problem that we know is far more complex. security, the first issue has to do with security concerns with piracy that need to be addressed in our view in a holistic way. Security in the region, well, security is a complex issue everywhere, and in the region that is also the case. Security is perceived differently depending on where you sit, on where you experience the problems of insecurity. And so for countries whose ships are crossing the region and who depend on the goods carried across these waters for economic development and so on, securing maritime routes is, of course, of key importance. I mean, for regional countries, piracy poses both an internal security issue and potentially a national security issue, jeopardizing relations with neighbors and international partners. It also represents a symptom of the difficulties in developing alternative economic activities for communities, or the fragilities in governance structures to implement the rule of law by authorities. And Giuseppe just mentioned the importance of the finish in terms of the trials of those perpetrating the criminal activities. So this is an evidence also sometimes of the fragilities in the ability of countries to take the process to this finish point. So in context, it is worth detailing whose security we are addressing when we speak of maritime security, or when we speak of piracy in particular. So which forms of insecurity are we addressing, and what is the nature of the security threats that we are dealing with? Because when we pose these questions, then the next question would be, what is the appropriate mechanism to address this? Is it a police issue? Is it a criminal issue? Is it an economic issue, a military issue? As we've seen here, kidnap and ransom, or piracy related to kidnap and ransom, is, after all, a marginal part of the revenues obtained through illegal maritime activities, although one that affects foreign vessels a great deal. So posing the question of whose security and what sort of insecurity we are addressing is, I think, fundamental when we start designing policies to address issues. The second aspect I would highlight is that international efforts to address the issue of piracy and kidnap and ransom in particular will need to be coordinated if we're looking at sustainable efforts. The report points out to the many connections that this specific issue then has to many other areas. And different states and organizations are actually engaged through different means. Are we sufficiently aware of what each other is doing? Are these efforts complementing and mutually reinforcing? What is the capacity of local partners to actually absorb training and capacity building and support, and to translate that into a more relevant output? I think we still lack information and visibility on many of these initiatives. Just the example of the EU's coordinated maritime presences, who have been developed and implemented in this first semester of 2021 under the Portuguese presidency of the EU. Very happy to be able to be a part of that step of the EU. Is a first step in a coordinated presence, but streamlining national activities and initiatives will require deepening this effort to include other forms of capacity building that are also being developed. So just coordinating the presence of the navies is not enough, I would say. More coordination needs to be made at other levels. And the final point that perhaps I would highlight is that regional and sub-regional cooperation around the Gulf of Guinea, anchored in the Yaoundé architecture, is an important but so far insufficient step, as it has been so far concentrated on insecurity at sea. And we know that the architecture is supposed to do more, and it's supposed to develop more. Even the EU's coordinated maritime presences is supposed to also tackle some of the underlying causes of these forms of insecurity. So addressing economic interests, supporting piracy, and other forms of interests actually requires that we move beyond the events at sea and look at events inland. And this is something that the report also helps us do, and stepping up support to the development of the blue economy in the region, activities regarding environmental protection, the sustainability of fishing policies, including the fishing policies of external states who are in the region, or tackling other illicit activities and trade, managing migration, improving the rule of law, and so on. All these are important issues that need international, regional, and national attention and investment, because this would, I believe, go a long way into making the context around piracy and this form of piracy that the report approaches particularly better. These efforts would be much more sustainable if we could also address many of these other issues. I would stop here my comments. We already have some questions, but I would perhaps open the floor to Katia and Giuseppe if they want to make any remarks regarding these comments that I made, and then I would just give them a few questions afterwards to answer. Katia, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you for the comments. I fully agree on all of the points. I think our report moved the focus on shore for exactly that reason that you were mentioning, that we don't really, perhaps it's easier to some extent to tackle the offshore dimensions, and those are also often the more visible ones. I think in terms of for me, one of the interesting things about the phenomenon of riverine criminality is that perhaps this is actually the part that produces more insecurity in the Niger Delta region to populations that travel to and from markets, and to fishermen, to local fishermen. So for me, in terms of your comment about the type of insecurity, I think for me, addressing riverine criminality, I think, is one important way of broadening the approach to piracy. And maybe it's not, I think sometimes it's thought as a little bit irrelevant, but I don't think so, especially perhaps if it does serve as a breeding ground for offshore piracy. But even if it doesn't, I think it's crucial to appreciate that this maritime criminality of that type is much more provides or gives much more insecurity to the regional level than deep offshore piracy does. In terms of the appropriate mechanisms, I think you're right. It was mentioned also at various meetings that were held just this month that it's about more than presences. I wish we could call it coordinated maritime priorities, because I think just being present there isn't the same as being prioritizing, for example, counter piracy. So I fully agree that it's an important initiative, but it needs to also move forward and to do so in a sort of sustainable way, of course, also addressing the types of maritime insecurity that are most seen from the regional perspective, and that is not necessarily deep offshore piracy. So yeah, those were my comments.
Thanks so much. Giuseppe, would you like to add something at this stage?
Yeah, simply that, thank you. Simply that the analysis is a factual analysis, the one we conducted. We haven't formulated a list of recommendations because we wanted to be factual as much as possible, so that the reader can have his own list of recommendations coming to his mind. Our factual analysis highlighted that, yes, the social elements related to the root causes of piracy are to be taken into consideration. These are elements which cannot be avoided, and there has to be an approach which is not only a law enforcement but also a criminal prevention one. The two approaches need to be working together and even connect, because we need to find also a way to support the Nigerian authorities in creating connections with the communities, between law enforcement and communities. These are all elements which emerge from the study and are quite important in terms of our conclusions. Together with the analysis related again to the typology of piracy groups, we can certainly say that the offshore groups are highly specialized groups which have developed a technique with time. It's not been something created recently. And while it's definitely different from the other typology of groups, which have a much less developed criminal specialization and technical capacities. Over, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in, so allow me to give you a set of 2 or 3, and then I would ask you to answer, and then we would move on to another set of 2 or 3. Timothy Walker, thanks so much, Timothy, for joining us today. He poses a first question asking if our West African Navy is achieving greater levels of interoperability for their patrols. And I would team up this question with Colonel Agustin Rocha. He's a former P-3 Orion aircraft commander. He asks, you are for sure aware that US AFRICOM makes a series of exercises in the area of the Gulf of Guinea called the Express series, like the Obagam Express, where allies try to build capacity for the nations to deal with this global problem. What do you think are the real impacts for these exercises? Do you think we can reach the willing of the countries to deal with the problem? So I would give you those 2 questions, and then we also have questions from Guinea-Bissau, I believe, and if I understand correctly, the question is, after this report, are you planning on elaborating the report any further in terms of the recommendations, as you mentioned, Giuseppe? What next steps are you planning for this? So I would leave it at that, and then we'll come back to the questions. Excuse me.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Do you want to go first, Giuseppe, or shall I?
Your microphone is...
Yeah. Please go, Katja, then I will follow.
I think the 2 first questions, I want to, just as a caveat, say that the report really, the aim of the report was to zoom in on the problem more than on the solutions, which of course is a weakness in the report. But I think if you have 90 pages and want to go into depth, we've really focused on the problem of piracy much more so than on the Yaoundé structure, on the international community's various efforts. The US AFRICOM has exercises, so does the French. I think there are so many capacity building activities that it's even difficult to get an accurate overview. But I think the 2 first questions kind of go together. Of course, the more exercises you do, like Obangame Express, the better navies get, not just at collaborating with the other Gulf of Guinea nations, but also with the external presence of whether that be US presence or French or soon the Danish, but also the Portuguese, etc. But the extent to which the interoperability has improved over the past years, I couldn't put a number on, but I would expect so, given the attention on that dimension. In terms of next steps, I think we hope both that in forums like these that we can contribute to discussing in diplomatic fora, but also with practitioners, what possible next steps to take, both in terms of practical inputs to future programs, but also, hopefully, I'm a researcher, in terms of providing more detail to the aspects that we haven't been able to touch upon in the report. And I think for me, links beyond Nigeria would be a very obvious point to address in future research, but perhaps also looking more at sort of the levels, the linkages between the 3 types of piracy that I already mentioned. And then obviously the solution side of things also does need a detailed analysis. And I think providing cost to what the sort of what Giuseppe just mentioned before, what it even costs to counter piracy, but also the different actors, there's international institutions and bilateral engagements, but the industry also has a role to play in counter piracy efforts. So Giuseppe, do you have comments?
Yes, I do, thanks. first element is the operations and the capacity building effort, notably through instruments like Obangame. It's important to note that the Obangame is at the moment where the navies are working together. It's a moment of interaction, which is extremely important, and I believe also productive results. We as UNODC have been working with Obangame to bring this legal finish aspect, specifically in cooperation with Interpol, and producing a simulation of a trial thanks to the collection of evidence conducted on board of vessels during the Obangame. We need to consider that a Navy vessel is the best ever training platform, not only for Navy personnel, but also for police, also for prosecutors and judges. This typology of law enforcement officers need to understand how the Navy operates. Because on one side, piracy has a peculiarity in legal terms, which is you have military staff doing law enforcement. It's totally peculiar. And when you do have military staff doing law enforcement, you need to be sure that the military staff knows how to speak with those law enforcement officers who have into the evidence collection, into the investigation and the prosecution and judicial decision, their expertise. The Navy has an expertise on many aspects. I was myself a Navy officer, and I was trained to do some specific law enforcement work. But the specialist of the law enforcement and the Navy should be put on the same table of conversation and help in dialoguing, which is the work we've been doing in cooperation with the US authorities within the framework of the Obangame, but also in cooperation with the French Navy and the NEMO, and generally speaking, in our capacity building work, bringing on the navies the law enforcement officers to achieve these results, also to hope to achieve these results, like judicial decision, which we are seeing now this month coming for the first time in the history of the Gulf of Guinea. So the importance of this operation is there. The importance of the support is there, and the results may come with time, but are certainly coming now, thanks to these cases which we are seeing. The effort from the coastal countries is there. We cannot deny that there is a strong effort. I'm not even mentioning the Deep Blue project, but generally speaking, the effort of the Navy officers from all the coastal countries with whom we work. Nigerian Navy has always been extremely open with us, allowing us to do exercises together on board of the assets. Is to the Nigerian Navy, we were able to organize a moment where the several law enforcement agencies were on board with us, able to see how the Nigerian Navy operates. And so this openness is something which we need to witness, and we are happy to do so. On another level, we see also cooperation in operational terms. We've seen the Gulf of Guinea is a region where you have quite a detailed structure on the architecture, thanks to the effort of the regional organization, ECOWAS and ECAS, but also and above all the coastal state themselves. We do have zones which some of them are operational. We do have protocols like the MOUs operational already for Zone E and F. We do have joint patrols in Zone D specifically, and we are seeing also effort for the ECOWAS task force with dialogue between the Nigerian and the Ghanaian Navy. So the efforts are there. We are also supporting now joint patrols, which may come soon between Ghana and Ivory Coast. So the efforts to achieve operation results and joint patrols are there, definitely there. And the coastal countries are showing engagement. Now, the problem is that the engagement has to be produced into a courtroom and achieve the rule of law. Because again, there's no law enforcement without legal finish. Doesn't make sense to speak about law enforcement if we are not able to bring our work at sea into a courtroom on land. Over.
Thank you so much for both your comments and Katya's, your answers to the questions. The point you've made regarding the other areas, the other issues surrounding the focus of the project and of the report itself. It's worth opening up. It's also worth looking into the collaborative efforts that are being developed and that you just mentioned also at the sub-regional level, and those are quite encouraging. And a bit on that note, there are two questions that I think go in that direction, and you may want to develop a little bit further that. Commander Correia Ribeiro from the SWAMES project, now in Abuja, he asks, with so many ongoing projects and initiatives, some finishing and others starting, what is the existing coordination mechanism for this cooperation in order to avoid overlapping and duplication of efforts, in addition to wasting, of course, scarce resources? I think Tim Walker's question goes a bit also in that direction, because he asks what do you think of the prospects for success of the new SHADE initiative for West Africa? What is needed to make it work? Maybe you can explain a little bit what the SHADE initiative is for some of our viewers and guests here today.
Giuseppe, do you want to go first? I mean, these are very, very important questions. I think they lie a little bit, I can reply to them, but they lie a little bit beyond the scope of what we discuss in the report. They're more on the sort of how to bring the findings of the report into further future action. The report really, I think, speaks more about what Giuseppe just mentioned, that we also need to see criminal prevention, that a lot of causes lie onshore as well. So I think this is a little bit of a different focus, but I think it's important as we discuss the role of SHADE, the role of coordinated maritime presences. The report really points to onshore issues that these forums somehow also need to find a way of, if not addressing, then finding other avenues to address. Giuseppe?
Thanks, Katya. From my technical perception, perspective, I found the SHADE quite interesting. I attended the operation session, and I found that this engagement is quite useful and important. I found this cooperation between the ICC and the Nigerian authorities in building up this SHADE quite interesting, and the operation session to which I have attended sounded also something which may produce concrete and positive outcomes. So in my technician perspective, I found this a good initiative. But I cannot go beyond this, my technician analysis, because it's not my specialization, I would say, evaluating the initiatives. I can say that my perspective as an attendee to the SHADE was positive. And I've attended several G7 sessions. Of course, we are talking of different typology of international effort and coordination initiatives, and this specific SHADE sounded like something which may produce interesting technical results. As much as we are also seeing the working group in the G7, and specifically the legal ones, in which UNODC is working with Cameroon, and the handover agreement, which are an important instrument for allowing this legal finish. Handover agreement are the instrument through which a coastal country can hand over a suspect to a nearby, where maybe the legal framework is allowing a legal finish. So that's my personal technical perspective on this topic.
Giuseppe, if I can follow up on that last comment, because we have another question, and it raises exactly the issue that you just mentioned about the handover agreements. The question is, in the case of pirates being arrested in the deep sea area, are there countries who are able or willing to prosecute the victim, well, not the victims, of course, the suspect. In the Gulf of Aden, it was internationally organized. So you are just mentioning this this agreement and the working group in the G7 dealing with this. Can you elaborate a little bit further in terms of this ability to have criminals prosecuted eventually in other countries, if they are willing to do that? I remember specifically that the UNODC participant in the training course in the Azores was speaking exactly about this and the push for having courts available in the region who would prosecute the suspects of these criminal activities.
Yes. So the first point is that I will also speak slowly because the quality of my connection. The first point is that prosecution and judgment are a matter for coastal state in the Gulf of Guinea, but there is a will certainly to legal finish among the coastal state. We can witness with our now 7-year work on the field on this thematic that there is a specific will. Some countries have achieved successful legal reforms. Nigeria, the 2019 SOPMO Act, Suppression of Piracy and Other Maritime Offences, is an effective tool which needs to be applied, has been applied in one case, the LOMA 6, but will be hopefully applied again against a pirate group on the 23rd of July, so in 3 days. So there are countries which can deliver legal finish. Another country who can deliver legal finish is certainly Togo. Togo has effectively reformed their legal framework. Other countries which are reforming their legal framework are certainly Cameroon is working on a legal reform, Ghana is working on a legal reform, and we are supporting Ghana specifically, but also Cameroon, but Ghana specifically in their work and efforts, which may deliver the capacity to prosecute piracy for offshore cases. But having countries with the legal framework is one step. It's not the only way. Some countries can have the legal framework, and others can simply hand over suspects apprehended at sea through the handover agreement, which are models developed through the experience in East Africa, and allowing a sort of working also on the existing legal framework, conventional legal frameworks in the region, specifically ECOWAS as a extradition and mutual legal assistance convention dated 1995. But working on this legal framework, the handover would allow the possibility for one navy to hand over suspects to another navy for prosecution in another country. And this would be a multilateral agreement, which is now under the consideration of the ECOWAS. ECOWAS is particularly proactive, has been particularly proactive in proposing this agreement, and we are technically supporting the handover agreements thanks to Project SWAMES. We are, however, supporting all the countries in the region in their legal framework, and we can say that successful results in Togo and Nigeria are something important and to be highlighted. Also, Gabon successfully introduced universal jurisdiction, and we are supporting Gabon also in potential additional little tweaks on the existing text. Over.
Can I briefly add the comment? I mean, I of course fully agree that legal finish is crucially important. I do think, in line with the comments that you also mentioned in the introduction, that we have equally to attend to prevention. So just to mention this as well, and flag that I think livelihood issues are crucial, that I think is becoming evident from findings in the report. So in addition to to legal finish and the reforms that are and the handover agreements, I think we also need to discuss in how we move forward, how that very difficult exercise of piracy and other crime prevention programs can be improved. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. Perhaps I can also chip in here with a couple of questions. I was wondering, and also because we have a lot of participants who have a background as Navy officers or who are currently Navy officers, and we've been looking at a large presence of Western Navy vessels and attention by the navies and the military, and looking at the balance, but in terms of investment and attention by international partners to the region, and also by regional states. What would you say is kind of the right mix right now between the importance of having the navies patrolling the region and securing secure maritime lanes for international traffic, and also the other activities? Because the report, as you have recurrently mentioned, is about giving us clues on how policy making can be better fine-tuned to deal with this problem. We've been dealing with prevention, as Katja just mentioned, the legal finish, but we also discussed the livelihoods. Looking at the mix of attention and activities, what would you say are the priorities in terms of the next steps? Keeping the navies engaged for sure, but what would the immediate attention need to be in the coming years? Because as Giuseppe just mentioned, he mentioned a 7-year effort just to get some movement on issues regarding legal prosecution and so on. So we need sustainable engagement in the region. What would you point as the priority areas for that engagement in complementing the efforts that are already taking place at sea?
You're welcome to go first, Giuseppe. This is a difficult question. I think the balance, the way I think about the balance is very much a question of long-term and short-term efforts. So in the short term, the navies will be able to suppress, perhaps, deter, but obviously not address any of the onshore dimensions of the problem, but it is likely to have a short-term impact. And then, of course, in addition to that, we need to contemplate how best to also address the long-term programs that have a more long-term perspective. And I think, for me, the shared awareness and deconfliction shade is one discussion that was taken mostly from how piracy was dealt with in the Horn of Africa. And I think this is not speaking as UNODC, but as a researcher who also published on Somali-based piracy. I think what the report says about how piracy is linked to other types of crime, for me, puts alarms about we have to be careful not to push current pirates into other types of crime as we move forward. I think we could say for Somalia that there's no piracy attacks, but the pirates are not necessarily engaged in, former pirates are not necessarily engaged in legal businesses, but in other types of criminal activity. And if we see for the Gulf of Guinea that there is a lot of other types of crime, as we describe in this report, that are even more profitable than kidnap for ransom piracy, then I think it puts on us a responsibility to think about that as we move forward, so we don't push currently engaged pirates into other types of criminal businesses, whether that be drug smuggling, oil, illicit oil activities. So it wasn't really an answer, but more maybe a complication to the question of how we do the long-term efforts.
Thanks so much, Katja. It was not an easy question, I am aware. Giuseppe, anything you want to add? We have another question that I might just put here on the pile, which is, are private military companies involved in fighting piracy, namely Chinese PMCs. So if you want to add that to your answer, that would be great.
Okay, the question about private security is a detailed and technical also question. In the Gulf of Guinea, we see private security operated by national authorities with military vessel protection detachment and military provided as private escort in the end. But this is a totally different line of conversation from the study. We can certainly say that we did an analysis also of the security element, but only related to the specific purpose of considering the response. I cannot respond. I don't know if there are. I cannot tell you any particular information about the existence and which private security are operational in the region. Certainly, there is a conversation to be had with all the authorities about the legal framework of private security in the Gulf of Guinea. That's certainly a topic which need to be discussed. The legal framework is important because there are elements which need to be clarified among the countries in the Gulf of Guinea, also related to the private security per se and the potential operation into the entire region, beyond, of course, the waters of competence of each coastal country. So these elements, we need a conversation certainly on the legal aspects related to the private security. In terms instead of the perception, of potential way forward, the analysis we are conducting again is a factual one. We are looking at gaps, and the gaps are certainly saying that the social, the element related to the Niger Delta is something related to the communities in the Niger Delta, to the life of the people, life expectation and quality of life of the population of the Niger Delta is important. And we are doing a specific and technical analysis also in terms of the perception of the pirate groups vis-a-vis the communities, which changes if you look.
Giuseppe, we're losing you. I'm sorry.
Perception.
We're losing you. Maybe if you turn off your video, we can hear you well. Let's try that.
Yes. Is it better now?
So far, so good. Please go ahead.
Okay, so perfect. I was mentioning resuming the need for a conversation on the legal aspects related to the private security in the Gulf of Guinea is certainly something which needs to be had, and we need to consider also that in East Africa we don't have reports about successful piracy attacks on vessels which had embarked security. Sorry, and then the question remains also. Next steps, as Katia was mentioning, on one side, the legal finish, which goes to the law enforcement, of course, and so the quantity of arrests at sea, and the criminal prevention on land, including building bridges between law enforcement agencies and local communities. So the study is analyzing the need for intervention in the Niger Delta, and the fact that this can be and has to be done in synergy with a more regional effort for prevening action on deep, on offshore. These two elements need to go together. Criminal prevention and law enforcement need to go together. And we need to consider that this is, again, a problem which starts on land, but also it happens at sea. And so the quality of the cooperation among navies, and then again, the quality of the potential for legal finish is something which needs to go together. We cannot ignore the land aspect and the maritime aspects as being two aspects of the same coin, which we need to address together with criminal prevention and law enforcement. Over.
Super, thanks so much for that. Sorry about the video, but this way it works a bit better. Before we conclude, and we're running out of time soon, we'll be running out of time soon. there's a question I would like to pose you, and it has to do with the role of private shipping companies. We've been looking at some efforts, and for instance, the support by the Danish MFA to this report is also an expression of the interest of trade-related and economic-related interests of Western states in the region, and of course we have the initiatives by private shipping companies. What can you tell us about the role that these companies have in this particular issue of kidnap and ransom piracy?
I mean, I think this is an important point to finish. I think for me, maybe a way to answer it based on the report is that the deep offshore pirates are, of course, causing most harm to the private shipping companies. And with the shift from petro-piracy to kidnap for ransom piracy, it's a much wider range of international shipping that is being affected, not only those that carry oil, but those that have valuable crew on board. I think we can also think about this in terms of the perspective that was asked with gaps in the international efforts and regional efforts. I think the private shipping companies are trying to step in with their own measures when they find that their crew are still unsafe after, what is it, almost 10 years after they own the code of conduct, et cetera, et cetera. So for the best way, of course, I think if we look at the Somalia case, is to bring in and enhance the discussion between private industry and international and regional efforts. That's how the shade mechanism worked in the Gulf of Aden in the Horn of Africa. So perhaps that too is how it can function as we move forward, so that it's a discussion between industry, but of course with much more emphasis on the role of regional states and actors, institutions, and international actors as well. Giuseppe?
Yes, I think you guys started really highlighting the key point. The offshore, the analysis of the report is highlighting a different typology of groups, the offshore and the riverine ones. And the riverine ones are an issue for the riverine communities, a huge issue, which is affecting strongly the economy. The offshore are targeting the industry in the end, but are first targeting the human being on board, are targeting the seamen, who are the first victims. And of course, the human aspect comes before and the economical after. The human aspect is that we had 141 sailors who have been kidnapped in 2020, according to some of the reports. The shipping industry, the private industry role in the shade is also something which has Kat has rightfully highlighted, and potentially we should also have a table of conversation between the private industry and the partners working on initiatives related to capacity building, but also operational results in the region. As UNODC, we are more than happy to have this conversation. We already have table of conversations with several members of the private industry, but more than happy also to listen more to the perspective of the private industry. I can already say, however, that if we confront the declaration on the Gulf of Guinea, which has been done now by more than, I believe, 300 private industry members, and our action, there are some points we are certainly there in line. We are working on the legal finish in the end. It's the final purpose of UNODC work in the end. And this is perfectly in line with the needs of the private industry, because the legal finish is also allowing certainly the entire justice system to work and the rule of law to be applied. These are some of the aspects for which the declaration and our work are coherent. Of course, these are some of the points. Over.
Giuseppe, if I can just direct you to another question from Tim Walker before we finish. He mentions the report refers that there is only one case ongoing. Has this trial been concluded? You mentioned that some trials might have been concluded at the sub-state level. Has any further information or data been revealed since the report was published? If you can update us on that.
Yes, so at the moment of publication of the report, the cases ongoing were two, the Dona, but the Dona is outside Nigeria, and of course the Ailunfeng, which is in Nigeria. And the Ailunfeng, as mentioned before, is the case we are all expecting because it's a case where you can see the cooperation between law enforcement agency, the Nigerian Navy, operating deep offshore, and the justice system. So it's a really important case. And we expect to see this coming out for decision on the 23rd of July. However, the case is also mentioning the Maximus, and many of you may have heard of the Maximus case. The Maximus case is when there was the previous piracy business model, a case where the pirates attacked an offshore vessel for oil theft purposes. The Nigerian Navy intervened, arrested the suspect, and we have seen a judgment in April this year where the Maximus crew, the suspects in the case, have been all sentenced to 7 years of jail according to not the Piracy Act, because the Maximus was, I believe, 2016, but the oil bunkering legal framework in Nigeria, and so the Oil Theft Miscellaneous Provisions Act. So this was the legal framework applied in this case. This is the scenario today. The scenario is with a decision coming 23rd. Maximus was decided in April, and we do expect more to come with a wishing successful operations to the law enforcement agencies in the region.
All right, thank you so much. We still have a couple of questions coming in, but unfortunately we've ran out of time, so I'm sure Giuseppe or Katia would be happy to exchange emails with some of you directly, and their emails are available online without prior asking them if they are willing to do that. I direct you to their emails, and allow me just to conclude this session by highlighting how thrilled we are that we could have this conversation, that we could look further in detail to this very timely report. This is the kind of information that we all need to somehow make our efforts that many of our countries are developing right now more coordinated, more effective, more on point regarding both the short-term needs, but also the medium and long-term needs for piracy, understanding the consequences of the actions that we support and implement, and getting into a setting where there is coordinated action and where states in the region have the lead, because obviously they are the ones who have to deal every day with the issues that piracy raises. So again, thank you so much to Katia and to Giuseppe for agreeing to cooperate today with the Atlantic Center on sharing the findings of their report. Thank you to everyone who joined the session today and for your questions and comments. We are thrilled to have all of you around. Stay tuned. We will have more activities of the Atlantic Center to come in the coming months after a short summer break that we probably all deserve very much. So that's all for me. Thank you so much. And read the report and republish, disseminate. I'm sure it will be a very useful tool for your work. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.